Welcome back to The Rise the Limit, where today a Georgia barrier island stacks its layers so thick you can climb 176 steps through them. Chapter 4. Jury's out, Tybee Lighthouse still shines, opens at a marine science center and winds up somewhere around 1526 when a failed Spanish colony called San Miguel de Gualdape collapsed in shipwreck, disease, and revolt, its enslaved Africans escaping to live among the Guale and its exact location still unknown to this day. From touch tanks full of turtles to colonial ghost sites buried under the same sand, this is a coastline where every footprint lands on someone else's story. Lured by the promise of rigorous scientific inquiry, my expedition arrived at the Tybee Marine Science Center. It quickly became apparent that the institution's noble mission, cultivating stewardship of Georgia's coastal resources, had been translated into a vernacular more easily understood by the flip-flop demographic. Turtles. A great many turtles. My son, acting as a junior auditor of biological accuracy, immediately noted the alarming ratio of chelonians to the near-total absence of fish. It felt as though we had stumbled into an aquarium that had suffered a very specific, shell-based coup. I, however, registered no complaint. I remain firmly in the pro-turtle camp. Yet even amid the reptilian buoyancy, the center made space for tragedy. A substantial exhibit was dedicated to the North Atlantic right whale, a creature that utilizes the waters off the Georgia coast as a sort of seasonal singles bar. In the 1800s, whalers dubbed them the right whale to hunt, a name born of a grim, ghastly pragmatism. They swum slowly. They were full of valuable oil. They had the courtesy to float after being killed. It was a philosophy of efficiency over longevity, not unlike searching for the right ancient redwood to convert into patio furniture. Scientists now use specialized underwater microphones at Gray's Reef, 19 miles out, to eavesdrop on the few that remain. They track the calls of a species that was simply too convenient for its own good. I stared at a display detailing their feeding method, a magnificent system of baleen filters that sifts krill from the water. They were nature's finest gentlemen, sporting colossal mustaches and minding their own business. Unsurprisingly, they are critically endangered. Needing a reprieve from this dose of industrial-era gloom, I drifted toward a smaller tank inhabited by a single, charismatic hawksbill turtle named Ossie. He possessed the same wizened face and patterned shell as a creature my son and I had encountered on a beach in the Azores, a memory tied to Portuguese hot sauce and poor life choices. Ossie floated with an air of profound indifference, his ancient eyes tracking my movement. He seemed to view me not as a visitor, but as a strange bipedal mammal staring through the glass, perhaps taking mental notes for a paper on primate bewilderment. The contrast was sharp. The gentle giants of the Atlantic were decimated by men who saw them as floating barrels of profit, a bleak monument to human avarice. Yet here was Ossie, safe behind glass, insulated from the hazards of the open ocean. We stepped out of the exhibit and into the salt air, our eyes adjusting from the tank lights to the grey daylight, shifting our focus from the creatures beneath the waves to the structures built to survive above them. 4 towers later, Tybee's light, war-scarred and working. The most conspicuous of these survivors is the Tybee Island Light Station, a black and white obelisk that has been built almost as often as it has been knocked down. The current tower represents humanity's 4th kick at this particular can, a monument to the stubborn refusal to let a perfectly good coastline go unilluminated. General James Oglethorpe ordered the first attempt, a simple wooden marker, in 1736. It was obliterated by a storm 5 years later, an act of nature that feels less like a tragedy and more like a harsh editor's note. A second attempt in 1742 relied on stone and wood, but the builders eventually conceded that a proper brick tower was required. The 1773 model, a proud 100-foot structure, was the one that finally stuck, at least until its own countrymen set it on fire. My son and I paid our admission and began the ascent of the station's 178 steps. As we climbed the spiraling iron staircase, the darkening sky outside the vertical tube seemed to offer a commentary on our judgment. While I focused on the hydraulic integrity of my own knees against the pull of gravity, I considered the Confederate soldiers who once stood here with a far more ambitious project, immolating the top 40 feet of the lighthouse to render it useless to the approaching Union fleet. It was a level of strategic spite one has to admire, akin to cancelling your own newspaper subscription just so the delivery boy has to walk an extra block for nothing. The Union Army, pragmatic as ever, simply used the smouldering stump for target practice against Fort Pulaski. Rebuilding began after the war, with the bottom 60 feet deemed salvageable and a new top added in 1867. A project delayed only by a cholera outbreak, the 19th century equivalent of supply chain issues. One might assume that having survived a storm, strategic arson, and a deadly pestilence, the lighthouse had earned some peace. One would be wrong. A hurricane cracked it in 1871, and the 1886 Charleston earthquake rattled it so violently that keepers reported the walls shaking for 30 seconds. This tower has endured more abuse than a royal food taster. From the catwalk, the wind howled. The Atlantic churned below, a grey expanse that made the 144-foot climb feel both monumental and utterly insignificant. We descended back to the salt and soil and walked toward the Tybee Island Museum, located inside Battery Garland. This concrete gun emplacement looks like a bunker designed by a particularly pessimistic giant. Its formidable outer shell, once intended to hurl projectiles miles out to sea, now acts as a protective carapace for the island's memories. Inside this quiet concrete beast, the relics of the past, from the keepers who lived here to the battles they witnessed, are kept safe, finally sheltered from the storms. Shoreline stronghold, from marshal's orders to museum doors. We had entered the radius of Fort Screven, a sprawling coastal defense complex that swallows the end of the island. Battery Garland is merely one component of this concrete beast, a product of the Endicott period, a fit of late 19th century anxiety when the government decided its shores looked too inviting and poured heroic amounts of cement to fix the problem. It feels like an attempt to build a child-proof cap for the entire Atlantic Ocean. The fort owes its existence to Brigadier General James Screven, a Revolutionary War figure who had been dead for over a century by the time the army realized they needed a name for the place in 1899. This posthumous administrative lag seems typical for the island. Before the military arrived, the area served as a watering station for Spanish explorers and, supposedly, pirates. But the history books offer a disappointing asterisk on that front. No cutlass-wielding celebrity ever established a base here. Tybee was the pirate equivalent of a sad highway rest stop, good for a quick drink, but not a place to plot an empire. The true celebrity connection belongs to a man who dealt in reconstruction rather than plunder. From 1932 to 1933, the fort was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel George C. Marshall. It is a strange dissonance to picture the future Nobel laureate and architect of the Marshall Plan spending a year on this sleepy sandbar, overseeing infantry drills and perhaps catching a picture show at the Tybee Post Theatre. He lived in one of the eclectic Queen Anne homes along Officers' Row, his thoughts likely weaving between the humidity of a coastal posting and the friction of a world slowly catching fire. Those houses still stand on their high berm, but the discipline has long since evaporated. After World War II, the army decommissioned the fort and sold off the land. The residences built for rigid military hierarchy now operate as vacation rentals, where the most pressing tactical decision involves choosing between a nap and the beach. The massive gun emplacements remain, but they sit silent and hollow, heavy artifacts resting on a coastline that has seen flags rise and fall with the tide. Shells to batteries, alliances on Savannah's contested coast. The quiet of the gun batteries invited a certain kind of skepticism. Did history on this coast really begin with a powdered wig and a British charter? Hardly. A placard back at the Fort Museum mentioning a Spanish presence in the 1600s had snagged in my mind, a small historical loose thread that, once pulled, unravelled a story far older and messier than the tidy grid of Savannah suggests. Before the English arrived, the Spanish and French had long called this region the Debatable Land, a polite 18th-century euphemism for a geopolitical free-for-all. The initial documented attempt at settling this coast was a masterclass in how not to start a colony. In 1526, a Spanish grandee named Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón landed with hundreds of settlers to found San Miguel de Gualdape. It was a groundbreaking effort that lasted just under 3 months. The settlement collapsed under the combined weight of starvation, disease, and a full-blown rebellion. Walking the beach, I imagined Ayllón's final journal entry. The fever is rampant, the men are mutinous, and a raccoon has made off with our last biscuit. On the plus side, the coastal views are lovely. The French Huguenots tried their luck nearby in the 1560s, only to be violently removed by the Spanish, who viewed this coast less as a place to live and more as a fence to keep neighbors out. Even the famed conquistador Hernando de Soto had a hand in shaping the region's fate. He didn't stay, but his brutal march through the interior in 1540 left a wake of destruction and European diseases that tore through the powerful Mississippian chiefdoms, effectively clearing the board for later players. By the 1600s, Spain had established a thin line of Franciscan missions along the Georgia coast to guard its claim on La Florida. It was a tenuous hold. The outposts were contested by French sailors looking for sassafras and ultimately doomed by local Guale uprisings and relentless slave raids from the English settlement at Charlestown. By 1686, Spain retreated south of the St. Mary's River. The withdrawal created a power vacuum, leaving the coast as a lawless gap on the map. A haven for pirates needing to patch a sail, and a refuge for the scattered remnants of native tribes. It was a coast left to the tides, and to the opportunists. So, when James Oglethorpe stepped ashore in 1733, he wasn't so much a trailblazer as a man arriving at a property after a long and very complicated escrow period involving several bankruptcies and a hostile eviction. As we covered in some depth in Chapter 1, the site he chose for his new city, a high ground known as Yamacraw Bluff, was already occupied by the Yamacraw Indians led by Chief Tomochichi, a man who proved to be more of a shrewd diplomat than a fearsome adversary. But the layers of occupation went deeper than politics. Evidence of an ancient past lay right under the colonists' feet, piled high in shimmering mounds along the riverbanks. For thousands of years, the original inhabitants had feasted on oysters here, leaving behind mountains of shells. These ancient kitchen middens, the discarded remnants of countless banquets, became the colonists' primary building resource. They burned the shells to create lime, then mixed it with sand and water to form tabby, a local variant of concrete. The first permanent buildings of Savannah were constructed from the recycled refuse of a civilization that had been there for millennia, an accident of architectural recycling that predates the Green Building Council by 3 centuries. Shells to strongholds, Bilbo, Wormslow, and the coast. To understand the scale of that recycling, I had to look past the English colonists and their tidy, aspirational squares. My search for the area's foundational truth required pushing deeper, past the Spanish missions and even the ghost of Hernando de Soto's disastrous march. Down I went through the strata of memory until all that remained was a colossal pile of shells near the mouth of the Savannah River known, with a disappointing lack of gravitas, as the Bilbo Mound. The name suggests a small, comfort-loving creature with a fondness for second breakfast, but this Bilbo was no hobbit hole. It was a sprawling settlement complex, a prehistoric metropolis built of refuse. Archaeology suggests the mound started its life as an artificial island, a deliberate act of civil engineering in the middle of a man-made pond. The builders dug canals to connect their private lake to the river and then used the excavated soil to create an exclusive slice of waterfront property. It was the world's most ambitious construction project to be made chiefly of dirt and leftovers. For a time, the site simply hosted a village, a place for domestic life and ritual, yet its significance lies in its age. Charcoal scraped from its lowest levels provides a radiocarbon date of roughly 3,545 BC. This makes the Bilbo Mound one of the oldest known engineered earthworks in North America, predating the pyramids at Giza. It is a structure so ancient it makes Stonehenge look like a recent and rather hastily assembled garden ornament. The scattered pottery found in its middle layers, undecorated and toughened with plant fibers, speaks to a culture so advanced it had already discovered minimalism. The crushed oyster shell mound hummed its silent 5,000-year-old story. This accumulation of countless meals served as a ceremonial hub and a burial ground for generations, a physical anchor for a civilization. Then, after millennia of quiet dignity, a new set of people arrived who saw not a sacred site, but a quarry. This prehistoric legacy was carted away to become the literal foundation of a new world. The fortified house at Wormslow, built by Noble Jones around 1745, was constructed from the bones of these ancient mounds. As one historian dryly noted of this practice, the colonists were not at all sentimental about the past. The builders of the 18th century simply saw an opportunity for cheap, durable materials, fusing one culture's history into another's walls. Tar and titles. Tybee's unsettled Spanish claim. With the image of the Bilbo Mound's cannibalized shells still fresh in my mind, the boundary between historical treasure and industrial debris felt particularly porous. It seemed fitting then to encounter a local dispute that cannot decide if it is an archaeological breakthrough or a pile of roofing waste. This specific enigma surfaced on a residential lot near the Tybee Island Lighthouse, centering on 3 bitumen discs that sit uncomfortably between these two possibilities. The artifacts were discovered in the 1990s by a local resident named Frank Drudy. They are substantial objects, weighing 60 pounds each and measuring 18 inches across, resembling heat-warped hockey pucks abandoned in the high grass. Drudy developed a theory that positions these blobs as the handiwork of Pedro de Quejo, a pilot and reconnaissance captain who scouted the coast in the spring of 1525 for his patron, Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón. Quejo's instructions were to claim the land for Spain by erecting stone markers, ensuring the name of Charles V would be visible to any rivals sailing past. The theory suggests that Quejo provided a solution to a logistical problem. The Tybee coast is nothing but sand. Finding the dunes devoid of suitable stones, the captain allegedly improvised, mixing sand, grass, and ship's caulking tar to mold his own monuments. The proof, proponents argue, is pressed into the side of the discs, a crude Spanish cross and markings interpreted as S, O, C, and G. These letters supposedly honor Ayllón's financier, Sancho Ortiz de Urrutia, and Charles of Ghent, the Holy Roman Emperor himself. A 16th-century territorial claim sealed in pitch. For a moment, the narrative holds together. You can almost picture the pilot on the beach, cursing the geology and fashioning his desperate tar and grass assertions of empire. But the romance of the story collides with the gritty reality of supply chains. Chemical analysis confirmed the material originated from Trinidad's Pitch Lake. While Sir Walter Raleigh visited that asphalt lake in 1595, it became a massive global supplier for road paving and roofing in the mid-1800s. Suddenly, the image of a Spanish explorer dissolves into the mundane picture of a 19th-century work crew. Considering that Fort Screven and the Tybee Lighthouse, both requiring constant waterproofing and maintenance, stand just yards away, the discs are likely leftover asphalt castings from a construction job. It is an explanation that carries all the gravity of a municipal pothole repair. Despite searches using ground-penetrating radar, no additional markers were found. The 3 known discs remain in a strange limbo, neither authenticated relics nor confirmed trash, hidden away in a private collection rather than a museum. I was left standing on a shoreline layered with the invisible footprints of Guale residents, Spanish missionaries, and Union artillerists, wondering if I had just brushed against the earliest European claim in Georgia, or merely some forgotten scrap from a long-ago paving contract. Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón, Santo Domingo, Icarus northbound. Known to history variously as conquerors, tyrants, visionaries, or middle management bureaucrats, the men who carved up the New World were a mixed bag of psychotic overachievers. While the ambiguous tar discs from Pedro de Quejo's scouting trip left me with more questions than answers back on the Tybee sand, the story of his boss's main event is a tragedy of almost perfect clarity. Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón was a 16th-century Icarus who equipped his wax and feather wings not with divine craftsmanship, but with a royal charter from Emperor Charles V. Aiming for the sun only to find that the American South had very strong opinions about atmospheric friction. To understand why a wealthy, sedentary judge would risk everything for a swamp he had never seen, you have to smell Santo Domingo in 1520. It was a city of suffocating contrasts wrapped in a wet blanket of tropical humidity. The air hung heavy with the cloying, sickly sweet stench of boiling molasses drifting from the ingenios, sugar mills that dotted the island. It was the scent of Ayllón's fortune, but also of the island's misery. In the streets, wealthy judges and merchants paraded in heavy velvets and silks, sweating through European finery entirely unsuited for the latitude. Nearby, enslaved Africans and the few remaining indigenous Tainos worked in rags, their bodies gleaming with exhaustion. Ayllón was a man of great learning and gravity, which is usually polite historical code for a boring man in an expensive suit. He felt a profound sense of inadequacy when he looked toward the mainland. He owned a sugar plantation and controlled hundreds of laborers, but his wealth was agricultural and bureaucratic, built on cane stalks and paper ledgers. He watched with jealous eyes as ships returned from Mexico laden with the immortal gold of the Aztecs. Men like Hernán Cortés, whom Ayllón viewed as uncultured upstarts, were achieving the kind of glory that echoed in the halls of Spain. Ayllón, meanwhile, remained a civil servant in a shrinking island economy, burning with the desire to trade his judicial robes for the armor of an adelantado. His daily life was a series of petty wars fought with stationery. The friction between Ayllón and Viceroy Diego Colón was the friction between a dying feudal past and a new bureaucratic future. Colón, the son of the great admiral, represented the old guard, claiming authority by blood and conducting himself with the arrogance of a man who believed the hemisphere was his family's personal rental property. Ayllón, as a judge of the Royal Audiencia, represented the new guard, the king's attempt to rein in the Columbus family through committees and audits. This professional insecurity solidified into trauma during a disastrous mission to Mexico in 1520. Sent to mediate a civil war between Cortés and Pánfilo de Narváez, Ayllón expected his rank to command respect. Instead, Narváez laughed at him. The judge was seized and locked in the hold of a ship like a common criminal. Used to the comforts of high office, he was trapped in the stifling, reeking dark, surrounded by sailors who mocked his station. He was forcibly deported back to the Caribbean, stripped of dignity. While Narváez eventually lost his eye and his army to Cortés, he managed to ruin Ayllón's reputation first. The spark for redemption and the eventual doom of the Georgia coast arrived with Captain Pedro de Salazar. Salazar had sailed northwest of the Bahamas and returned with a cargo that stunned the Caribbean: the giants. These indigenous captives were physically imposing, standing significantly taller than the malnourished Lucayans the Spaniards were accustomed to seeing. Witnesses in Santo Domingo were awestruck, noting the captives were dressed in the skins of lions and bears. To Ayllón, these tall, healthy people were living proof of a new Andalusia to the north, a place worth conquering to wipe away the stain of his failure in Mexico. Ayllón convinced himself that these robust captives came from a land of plenty, rather than simply being people who hadn't spent the last 2 decades being worked to death on sugar plantations. He saw the giants as his ticket out of the courtroom. He bought the pig in a poke, and he began to plan a colony. Chicóra's Tall Tales, Ayllón's Gamble in South Carolina. In 1521, gambling his fortune on the theory of the giants, Ayllón hedged his bet. Rather than sailing himself, he dispatched an employee, Francisco Gordillo, who linked up in the Bahamas with a pilot named Pedro de Quejo, the same mariner whose alleged tar markers would later confound residents back on Tybee. Finding the islands inconveniently empty of people to enslave, the pair sailed northwest, making landfall on the South Carolina coast on June 24th, the feast day of St. John the Baptist. In a performance of calculated hospitality, the Spaniards spent weeks trading linen shirts, red caps, and combs for local marten skins, pearls, and silver. It was a long con designed to lower defenses. On July 15th, the trap snapped shut. With roughly 70 men and women aboard touring the caravels, the captains weighed anchor. The ships turned back toward Santo Domingo, dragging the screaming families away from the river of St. John the Baptist and toward the slow, grinding death of the Hispaniola sugar mills. Among the human cargo was a young man who possessed a frantic will to survive and an intuition for the specific weaknesses of his captors. Baptized as Francisco and attached to the judge's household, he quickly realized that in the eyes of Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón, a field laborer was expendable machinery, but a guide to a magical kingdom was a strategic asset. Francisco made the pivotal decision to weaponize the judge's greed. He began to map out a landscape of fabrication so elaborate and specific that it defied casual skepticism, inventing the land of Chicóra to match the fantasy already festering in Ayllón's mind. He described a province of wealth and wonder, confirming exactly what the judge, desperate for a legacy, wanted to hear. Ayllón consumed these fictions as intelligence, preferring the lie that offered glory to a truth that offered nothing. Ayllón's Valladolid show, Chicóra Tales and Paper Wars. For Francisco, the strategies of survival had evolved from intuition to performance art. Dragged to Spain to sing for his supper, his decision to invent a homeland full of fantastical creatures was a high-stakes gamble, akin to lying on a resume about knowing Excel. Eventually, someone is going to ask you to make a pivot table, and then you are in serious trouble. Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón arrived at the royal court in Valladolid in 1523 not merely as a petitioner but as a theatrical producer with his star performer in tow. Francisco had realized that his value, and his only ticket home, lay in his novelty, and he willingly became a living prop for Ayllón's ambition. In the presence of the young Emperor Charles V and the court chronicler Peter Martir d'Anguillera, Francisco delivered a monologue that would have swept the Academy Awards had they existed and not been focused on movies about sad people in cardigans. He spun yarn after yarn about his homeland, Chicora, and the neighboring province of Duhare. He told of a king named Datha, a man of gigantic stature who had to be carried on the shoulders of his subjects because he was physically too large to walk, a detail that sounds less like majesty and more like a severe metabolic disorder. He captivated the nobility with tales of the Inisiguanin, a race of men with inflexible, bony tails a palm long who were forced to dig holes in the ground just to sit down comfortably. He described a pastoral paradise where natives milked tame deer to make cheese, a claim Peter Martyr dutifully recorded in his De Orbe Novo. Ayllón stood by, nodding at these fabrications to prove that a new Andalusia awaited the crown's blessing, confirming that marketing truly is the world's oldest profession. On June 12, 1523, Charles V signed the Capitulación, a royal contract granting Ayllón the title of Adelantado and the rights to settle the coast. The document was a masterpiece of legal hypocrisy. It explicitly forbade the enslavement of the native people, framing the mission as one of peaceful conversion, a reform Ayllón publicly championed to align with the progressive policies of the Dominicans. Yet the entire enterprise was bankrolled by Ayllón's sugar plantations and indigenous slave labor on Hispaniola. The contract even permitted the importation of enslaved Africans and the purchase of natives if they were enslaved by native custom. Thus, the man posing as a humanitarian launched a colony powered by chattel slavery, financed by the very exploitation he claimed to renounce. Back in Santo Domingo, Ayllón mobilized a civilization in miniature. He liquidated his fortune, spending up to 100,000 ducats to outfit a massive fleet of 6 ships. This was not a mere exploration. He intended to transplant Spanish society whole. He recruited 600 settlers, including women, children, and Dominican friars, to enforce the spiritual mandate. Below decks, he packed the ships with horses, pigs, cattle, and sheep. Of course, cramming that many biological engines into a wooden hull for a summer voyage doesn't make you a rancher. It makes you the manager of a floating, vomiting petting zoo. Just as the fleet prepared to sail, the venture was paralyzed by a bureaucratic nightmare that would have made a Department of Motor Vehicles employee weep with joy. Juan Ortiz de Matienzo, Ayllón's former partner, filed a lawsuit in March 1526, claiming he was the true discoverer of the coast. This legal war stalled the fleet in the harbor for months. While Ayllón fought the paper war, his supplies rotted and his settlers grew restless. He eventually defeated Matienzo's claims, but the litigation consumed the critical spring planting season. Instead of sailing in April, the fleet launched in mid-July 1526. Litigation is often criticized for draining the life out of honest enterprise, and rightly so. Speed, however, is the virtue of the hurricane, which respects no legal injunctions and waits for no audit. The ruin of San Miguel de Gualdape. That litigation back in Santo Domingo, the bureaucratic stagnation that held the fleet hostage while men in velvet argued over paperwork, meant the expedition arrived at the River Jordan not in the gentle embrace of a spring planting season, but in the volatile, humid fury of August. If the conquistador was the unstoppable force of early modern history, the sandbar was the immovable object, and the meeting of the two on August 9, 1526, was less of a collision and more of a clumsy, wet thud. The flagship Capitana was the colony's floating warehouse, carrying the bulk of the flour, wine and salted meat intended to keep 600 people alive through the winter. As the ship attempted to cross the shallow bar, likely pushed by a sudden squall, the hull groaned and snapped. It is a sound that requires no translation. It sounds exactly like net worth evaporating. In a matter of minutes, the salt water ruined the sustenance of an entire fledgling society. Judge Ayllón, watching from the deck, realized his venture had transformed from a conquest into a survival scenario before anyone had even unpacked. The disaster provided the perfect exit strategy for the fleet's star attraction. For 5 years, Francisco de Chicora had played the role of the civilized native, dazzling the court with tales of milkable deer and kings with bony tails to secure a return ticket. With the Spanish distracted by their sinking pantry, Francisco shed his doublet and hose, physically deleting his user profile, and vanished into the forest. Ayllón watched his indispensable guide disappear, taking with him the maps, the alliances, and the convenient fiction that this land was a paradise. The judge realized too late that the giants and gems were just a clever trap, a narrative device designed solely to return a kidnapped man to his own zip code. Desperate to pivot, Ayllón ordered a relocation 40 leagues south to a site named San Miguel de Gualdape, likely near what I know today as Sapelo Sound. While the sick traveled by ship, the able-bodied men undertook a brutal overland march through a landscape that was definitely not the new Andalusia promised in the brochures. It was an acidic sand trap. They trudged through the same pine barrens and sucking swamps that characterize the coast today, arriving in late September only to find that the local Guale Indians were neither able nor willing to support a sudden influx of 600 desperate, hungry roommates. By October, the situation had devolved from tragic to horrific. Because the lawsuit had burned the planting season and the ocean had swallowed their stores, the colony faced immediate famine, disease. Likely dysentery brewed in the stagnant swamp water, swept through the camp. The settlers were too weak to catch the fish swimming right in front of them. In a moment that signaled the total collapse of their social hierarchy, the starving knights began to slaughter their horses for meat. To compound the misery, the climate threw a curveball. The Little Ice Age sent early, severe frosts plunging down the coast, freezing settlers to death in a tropical paradise that had clearly lied on its resume. Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón died on October 18, 1526, the feast of St. Luke, in a drafty shelter that offered no protection from the cold or his own failures. In his final delirium, the irony must have been suffocating. He had spent a fortune to lead his people to a fever-ridden graveyard. He had championed a peaceful colonization, yet he died amidst starvation and the rumblings of mutiny, leaving a power vacuum that his lieutenants were already circling like sharks. Experience, it turns out, is simply the name we give our fatal mistakes. Fire and Freedom, San Miguel de Gualdape to Guale. Really, dying was the easy part. Succession is hell. Following Ayllón's death on October 18, 1526, the colony of San Miguel de Gualdape did what any group of freezing, starving, and heavily armed men would do. It collapsed into a violent power struggle. Although Ayllón had technically designated his nephew Juan Ramirez as the successor to this muddy kingdom, Ramirez was busy drinking wine in Puerto Rico, leaving command to Captain Francisco Gómez. This transfer of legitimacy was immediately challenged by Ginés Doncel, a lieutenant with a mutinous streak, and his enforcer, Pedro de Bazan. They mobilized the malcontents, men desperate to abandon the failing settlement, and launched a coup, arresting Gómez and the town magistrates and imprisoning them in Doncel's own house. The camp itself devolved into a nightmare of scarcity. Settlers died for want of bread while watching school after school of fish swim in the river, lacking the strength or the tackle to catch them. Renegade soldiers abandoned the fort to demand food from neighboring Indian villages, only to be slaughtered by the Guale for realizing too late that hospitality has a strict expiration date. In the midst of this Spanish Civil War, the enslaved Africans in the colony, likely anticipating that the starving Europeans would soon turn on them, launched a coordinated uprising. They say you should fight fire with fire, but in a wooden fortress on a freezing coast, actual fire is much more effective. While the mutineers plotted assassinations, the rebels set fire to Ginés Doncel's house, the very location where the legitimate leader, Francisco Gómez, was being held prisoner. The arson created mass confusion, drawing the entire population to the flames and breaking the mutineers' control. Amidst the shouting, loyalists led by the Hidalgos Oliveros and Monasterio managed to free Gómez and capture the mutineer Bazan, who was subsequently beheaded. Crucially, the Africans did not stick around to see who won the execution lottery. Having witnessed the Europeans' inability to feed themselves or survive the cold, the rebels chose to defect to the local Guale Indians. This escape represented a total rejection of the Spanish colonial model. While the conquerors froze within their fortifications, the Africans successfully integrated into the indigenous world, securing survival through alliance rather than conquest. Spanish records note that the escaped slaves were never recaptured, marking the first successful, permanent self-liberation by enslaved Africans on the continent. By mid-November, the situation was untenable. The 150 survivors, down from an original 600, frantically boarded the remaining ships. The evacuation was a chaotic, freezing ordeal. There was an attempt to transport Ayllón's body back to Santo Domingo, towing the corpse behind a ship in a skiff, but chronicles diverge on the final outcome. Some state the body was lost to the sea when the rope snapped during a storm. Others suggest he was buried in a secret, unmarked grave at Gualdape to prevent desecration. The return voyage was deadly. On one ship alone, 7 men froze to death, and another man lost the flesh from his legs when he attempted to remove his frozen clothing. The arrival of the survivors in Santo Domingo stood in grim contrast to the departure of the Grand Fleet months earlier. Ayllón had launched the largest colonization effort in North American history to that date. What returned was a shattered remnant of sick, emaciated people carrying nothing but stories of mutiny and death. The ambitious New Andalusia had dissolved, leaving behind only the bones of its governor, the charred ruins of San Miguel, and a group of free Africans living among the Guale. As for the creditors back in Santo Domingo, they were left with the sinking realization that they had financed a fortune to purchase a graveyard. Chasing San Miguel de Gualdape along Georgia's marshes. Between the smoke of the mutineers' burning houses and the frantic departure of the freezing survivors, the physical reality of the colony simply dissolved. The search for San Miguel de Gualdape is a collision between the 16th century Spanish bureaucrats' obsession with recording every minute detail and the Atlantic coastline's obsession with grinding everything into sludge. The former produces libraries of testimony. The latter produces barrier islands that migrate like slow-motion luggage carousels. In the long run, the sludge usually wins. Pinpointing the exact location of the settlement has become the chosen fixation of a specific breed of historian, the kind prone to heated shouting matches over the circumference of an olive jar. The forensic trail starts with the expedition's initial landfall in July 1526. Ayllón's fleet first stumbled ashore at a place they dubbed the River Jordan, likely near modern Winya Bay or the Santee River in South Carolina, where they achieved the doubtful engineering feat of wrecking their flagship and sinking their food supply. With the flagship lost and the local swamps unpromising, the expedition packed up its misery and moved. They trudged approximately 40 to 45 leagues to the southwest, about 130 miles, tracking the coastline until they found a suitable spot to die in. They formalized the new town on September 29th, the feast day of St. Michael, christening it San Miguel de Gualdape. If you ever wonder why a 16th century settlement bears a specific name, simply check which Catholic saint was being martyred on the calendar that afternoon. The leading theory regarding the site, championed by scholars deciphering the pilot logs of Alonso de Chaves, points towards Sapelo Sound, Georgia. The math is compelling. If you start at the Savannah River and travel 45 leagues southwest, you arrive precisely at Sapelo. Furthermore, the area was the stronghold of the Guale people, a name that sounds suspiciously synonymous with Gualdape if you slur your speech, which, given the dehydration and lack of fresh water, the colonists likely did. However, a rival faction argues for the Savannah River. This group waves the 1529 Diego Ribeiro map like a holy relic, noting that it depicts a corrected coastline with a large river mouth exactly where Savannah sits today. The hydrography matches the Spanish descriptions of a great river with deep drafts, better than the smaller inlets to the south. Some theories even suggest Tybee Island itself, though the island lacks the freshwater resources necessary to sustain 600 people who aren't carrying bottled water from a convenience store. The difficulty in verifying any of this lies in the fact that San Miguel de Gualdape was essentially a camping trip that went horizontally wrong. The settlement existed for less than 3 months, from late September to November 1526. Archaeologists call this a shallow archaeological footprint, a polite way of saying the colonists didn't stay long enough to build stone foundations or accumulate a significant garbage dump. To confirm the site, one would need to unearth a specific cluster of 1520s artifacts, early olive jars or distinct glass trade beads, hidden in hundreds of miles of shifting marsh. I stood on the edge of the water near Tybee, scanning the dark, churning inlet where the Savannah River bleeds into the Atlantic. The tide was high, consuming the mud banks where a desperate Spaniard might once have dropped a pottery shard or lost a button in the rush to evacuate. The landscape offered no clues, only dense reeds and the smell of salt and decay. Without a map or a monument, does the ground remember a flag that was never truly planted? So maybe that's the real lesson Tybee keeps teaching from its lighthouse perch. Every layer you dig through, whether it's colonial tabby made from ancient shell mounds or a failed Spanish colony whose enslaved people walked into freedom and vanished from the record, reveals someone else's version of the coast, built right on top of the last one. The jury may still be out on where San Miguel de Gualdape actually stood, but the lighthouse, rebuilt 4 times on the same stubborn patch of sand, seems to argue that some places just refuse to let go of you. If you enjoyed this journey, the complete travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon, Palmetto Bugs, and Broken Arrows. And if you want to come behind the scenes and get bonus content, you can join my community on Patreon. This has been The Rise the Limit, and that, friends, is where the road ends, at least for this trip. Thanks for riding along. Somewhere between a 16th century conquistador sinking his dead commander's body into the Mississippi and a 21st century tourist dodging king tide flooding on Tybee Island, there's a story worth telling. This is The Rise the Limit, Chapter 5. Hernando de Soto and Tybee Pirate Week. From the Lady of Cofitachequi placing pearls on Hernando de Soto before he repaid her with kidnapping, to Pirate Week festivities on a barrier island still shaped by dredging, jetties and old fort batteries, this one covers a lot of coastline, so let's get moving. The coast went quiet for 14 years. After the last starving survivor of Ayllón's project fled back to Hispaniola, the only legacy left by the ambitious Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón was a silence that stretched across the marshes and some abandoned hardware rusting in the mud. Then came Hernando de Soto. A man who had grown rich dismantling the Inca Empire, De Soto arrived in Florida with a private army and a plan to replicate the feat in North America. By 1540, his expedition was slogging up the Savannah River basin, hungry and disappointed. The gold was missing, the land was a monotonous gauntlet of pine and swamp. Just as morale bottomed out, they encountered Cofitachequi. The Spanish braced for a volley of arrows but received a masterclass in diplomacy. A commanding woman, the leader of this powerful Mississippian chiefdom, was carried to the riverbank on an ornate litter. The Spanish called her the Lady of Cofitachequi. She governed a society so organized it might have given the Romans pause, inheriting her position from her aunt. A matrilineal transfer of power that likely baffled the rigidly patriarchal conquistadors. Aware of a recent plague and ongoing conflicts with rival groups, she chose negotiation over war. She crossed the water and draped a long strand of freshwater pearls around De Soto's neck. She led the Europeans into her main town, near the site of modern-day Augusta, and opened the temple that served as a tomb for past nobles. It held chests of pearls harvested from river mussels and stacks of fine deerskin blankets. But amid the local splendors, De Soto's men spotted something jarringly familiar. There, in a tomb 120 miles from the Atlantic, lay a Spanish dagger and several steel axe heads. For De Soto's men, it must have been a disorienting moment. They had marched through what they assumed was an untouched wilderness, only to find their country's scrap metal waiting for them. The items were relics from Ayllón's catastrophic failure on the coast 14 years prior. Their presence here, treated as sacred objects in a powerful inland chiefdom, proved that pre-colonial America was not a collection of isolated tribes. It was a deeply interconnected continent. News and trade goods traveled hundreds of miles with an efficiency that put European logistics to shame. To the people of Cofitachequi, the axe heads were a story and a warning. They were tangible evidence of the pale men who had appeared by the Great Water and then vanished. They were a prologue. De Soto, unfortunately, was not a man who appreciated historical irony. He saw pearls, not political subtleties. Despite the lady's hospitality, he plundered the town's tombs. He then compounded the insult by kidnapping the Lady of Cofitachequi, forcing her to accompany his army as a hostage and guide. She would eventually escape, but the damage was permanent. The most devastating thing De Soto left behind wasn't the memory of his theft, but the pathogens his men carried. The invisible cargo of disease tore through the population, triggering the collapse of the very society he had marveled at. Standing near the mouth of that same river, I pulled up a map on my phone. I followed the Savannah's lazy brown path on the screen, tracing the route inland past marshes and forgotten ferry landings toward the hills of Augusta. A swipe of a finger covered the 100+ miles that had taken De Soto's men weeks of hard marching. It was a digital pilgrimage from the site of one disaster to the scene of the next. I found no pearls and no rusty daggers. There were only the silent, invisible lines connecting a failed dream on the coast to the appropriated relics that became its epitaph. Pearls before plunder, Cofitachequi's lady slips away. If the Spanish daggers found in the temple were a prologue, we were now turning the page to the main character. De Soto's exhausted army had followed the Savannah River upstream, subsisting on little more than grit and a profound sense of poor judgment, until they stumbled upon the main town of the Cofitachequi chiefdom near what is now Augusta. Instead of greeting the armored, walking calamity of the Spanish expedition with a volley of arrows, a perfectly defensible choice, all things considered, The Lady of Cofitachequi opted for a master class in political theatre. She appeared on the far bank of the river, carried on a litter like a queen in a Shakespearean history play before being paddled across in a decorated canoe to meet the interlopers personally. This was not a welcome mat, it was a power move. In a scene recorded by Spanish chroniclers with breathless astonishment, she removed a heavy rope of freshwater pearls from her own neck and draped it over De Soto's. It was a gesture of immense diplomatic weight, a demonstration of wealth so casual it bordered on disdain used as a weapon. De Soto, a man who likely evaluated art by how easily it could be melted into ingots, probably just saw the pearls as a non-metallic inconvenience on his way to the gold he was certain lay just over the next hill. He had arrived looking for El Dorado and found a freshwater pearl empire, a subtlety entirely lost on him. Her hospitality wasn't born of naivete. Her people had been ravaged for 2 years by a plague, which explained the silent, abandoned towns the Spanish had passed. She was also managing a conflict with a rival chiefdom, the Ocute. In De Soto's bedraggled but heavily armed force, she likely saw a brutish but useful potential ally. Her authority, inherited from her uncle, hinted at a matrilineal society where power flowed through women, a concept probably more alien to the Spanish than finding European daggers in a Native American temple. Naturally, the diplomacy was short-lived. After failing to find the yellow metal that fueled his entire enterprise, De Soto fell back on habit. He plundered the town's temples, stealing the chests of pearls and the finely crafted deerskin blankets intended for the dead. Frustrated and ever the gracious guest, he then kidnapped the Lady of Cofitachequi. His plan was to use her as a guide and a human shield to guarantee safe passage as he marched his disappointment north toward the Carolinas. For weeks, she served as a captive navigator for an army of walking disasters. She was forced to lead them through her own territory, a queen reduced to a tour guide for her kidnappers. But she was merely waiting for her moment. Somewhere near the Appalachian foothills, she executed one of history's most brilliant and understated escapes. Citing the universal need for a private moment, she stepped into the woods. She then promptly vanished, taking with her a few attendants and, as a final flourish of magnificent defiance, a chest filled with the finest of her own stolen pearls. One detail hangs in the historical haze of that march. There is a tradition that one of De Soto's own African slaves quietly helped the Lady of Cofitachequi make her escape. Whether provable or not, the story illuminates the true nature of the expedition. Not a monolithic force of conquerors, but a fractured camp of Spaniards, native allies, and enslaved Africans, all plotting their own survival. While De Soto chased a fantasy of empire, the Lady of Cofitachequi simply walked away with his prize. She slips out of the European record there, a ghost with a box of jewelry, leaving De Soto to wander aimlessly onward. She won her personal battle, but her world would lose the war. The diseases the Spanish carried, far more effective than their swords, tore through the Mississippian societies, triggering a collapse from which they never recovered. Decades later, another Spanish expedition would find Cofitachequi diminished, led by a man. The lady's world was fading. After she walked into those woods, things for her people really went south. De Soto's folly: pearls, raids, and a river grave. While the Lady of Cofitachequi successfully dissolved into the mythos of the landscape, the precise coordinate of her exit can be narrowed down with the geographic fussiness of a property surveyor. She slipped the clutches of Hernando de Soto's traveling circus not just somewhere in the woods, but specifically between Guale, which modern archaeologists place near Morganton, North Carolina, and the expedition's next stop at Guaxul in the Pisgah region. De Soto, suddenly stripped of his most valuable hostage and a chest of fine pearls, pointed his army northwest. It was a route defined by stubbornness. the path of a man convinced that the next lottery ticket is the winner if he just keeps scratching. The expedition paused at Guale just long enough to confirm their guide was truly gone before pressing onward. His path became a desperate scribble across the map, trudging over the mountains and dropping into the Nolichucky and French Broad valleys to Chiaja, a fortified town perched on an island in East Tennessee. Looking at the topography today, you can almost hear the armored sigh of relief. It was a defensible spot to restock and reconsider the wisdom of angering everyone they met. De Soto's thoughts likely remained as tangled as the Appalachian undergrowth he had just hacked through. From Chiaja, he followed the rivers, French Broad to the Holston to the Tennessee, a liquid roadmap leading him to Cost on Bustle Island and south to the chiefdom of Coosa, always seeking bearers, food, and the yellow metal that fueled the entire calamitous enterprise. The gamble for glory finally went bust in a burst of fire at a stockaded town called Mobile on October 18, 1540. Employing his signature negotiating style, De Soto seized the paramount chief Tuscaloosa as a hostage. This time the tactic merely lured the Spaniards into a well-laid trap. The ensuing fight ground on all day, ending only when the town was a smouldering ruin and the Spanish force was, in military parlance, badly mauled. In the chaos, the remaining plunder from Cofitachequi, including those famous baskets of freshwater pearls, was lost to the flames. It was a fittingly absurd accounting error. The only tangible wealth they had extracted from the continent was incinerated in a battle they technically won. Winter arrived like a final notice from a collection agency. The battered army tried to regroup in Chickasaw country, nursing wounds and regret. But on a cold night in early March, their hosts decided the lease was up. A pre-dawn Chickasaw raid torched the Spanish camp, turning the settlement into a chaotic bonfire and forcing a retreat so hasty that some men left their pants behind. It was a level of operational failure usually reserved for a child's birthday party, where the clown cancels. Shaken and singed, De Soto lurched his column northwest until, in May 1541, they stumbled upon the banks of the Mississippi River. They made a celebrated crossing, the first by Europeans to be properly documented, before blundering into Arkansas like uninvited guests at a family feud. By 1542, the momentum that had carried the expedition across a continent ran out of fuel. Near a village on the Mississippi, Hernando de Soto, the self-proclaimed son of the sun, fell ill and died. His men, fearing a complete collapse of their terrifying facade if the locals learned their god was, in fact, biodegradable, performed one of history's more ghoulish disposals. They secretly weighted his body and sank it in the great river by the dark of night. It offers a tough lesson in divine marketing. Discovering your deity has a fatal fever doesn't necessarily make you lose your faith, but it certainly makes you wish you had read the celestial fine print. De Soto's ghost, river gauntlet, sea escape. Dying and being discreetly sunk in the Mississippi River was perhaps the savviest career move Hernando de Soto ever made. It left his subordinate, Luis de Moscoso Alvarado, to inherit command in May 1542, a promotion akin to being named captain of a ship just moments after it has snapped in two. Saddled with hundreds of starving men deep in the North American interior, Moscoso reviewed his options. They ranged from bad to catastrophic. He gambled on the former, deciding on a grand overland march to New Spain, a plan that possessed a certain bold, direct, and profoundly misguided logic. On June 5th, the diminished force lurched west, leaving the relative security of the Great River for the unknown variables of Caddoan country. They trudged through what would become eastern Texas, a land stubbornly devoid of golden cities but rich in salt licks and scattered fields. This proved unhelpful for an expedition whose entire economic model was based on plunder. After marching for roughly 150 leagues, the brutal math of empty bellies and endless horizons forced a reckoning. The grand westward plan had collapsed. It was a 16th-century navigational error of impressive scale, the equivalent of driving 1,000 miles before admitting you were holding the map upside down. There was nothing to do but turn around and make the long, sullen walk back to the water. By late 1542, the survivors were back at the Mississippi, presumably with a newfound appreciation for navigable rivers. At a village called Aminoya, they conceded that the only way out of La Florida was to float. Winter became a frantic season of shipbuilding. They became, by necessity, desperate manufacturers. The men felled timber for hulls and planking and built forges to hammer out nails. This last task required a grim sort of metallurgical irony. Their primary source of iron was the very equipment they had carried for 3 years to subjugate the land: horse tackle, spare armor, and the heavy shackles meant for slaves they no longer possessed. Launch day arrived on July 2nd, 1543. 7 freshly minted brigantines, crude but functional, slipped into the current. The retreat was not a clean break. The run to the Gulf became a brutal 17-day gauntlet. A paramount chief named Gualdape, who clearly had not been consulted on their departure itinerary, dispatched his fleets to shadow them. For days on end, warriors rained arrows on the Spanish flotilla from the banks and swift canoes, turning the river into a defended corridor with a lethal welcome committee. Makeshift wooden screens and repurposed armor saved some, but men died on the water just as they had died on the land. When they finally spilled out into the open Gulf, the convoy hugged the coast, inching west-southwest for weeks. After a voyage that served as a purgatorial encore to their overland disaster, they spotted the Pánuco River on September 10th, 1543. They had found the edge of New Spain. The final headcount was approximately 311 survivors from an initial force of over 600. The great enterprise, fueled by dreams of gold and glory, ended not with a triumphant fanfare, but with a few hundred traumatized men stumbling ashore. Their only treasure was the fact that they were still breathing. They had set out to conquer a continent and ended up grateful to have merely survived it. Sea walls to statesmanship. Marshall's Tybee beginnings. The museum displays detailed the ambitions of those early, desperate arrivistes, men who washed ashore clutching useless maps and dying for gold. But I had come to Tybee for a more disciplined ghost. I was on a pilgrimage for General George C. Marshall. My mission was to find the spot where the man who organized the Allied victory in World War II spent a year attending to the pressing business of inspecting barracks. It seemed a profoundly odd setting for the architect of post-war Europe, a biographical mismatch akin to learning that Napoleon had a brief, unstoried career as a lifeguard. The search led me out of the exhibits and into the former Fort Screven, an enclave where history hasn't been preserved so much as it has been politely asked to move in and pay taxes. The grand houses of Officers' Row, where the quartermaster, that great arbiter of accommodation, once allocated square footage based on rank, still stand beneath a canopy of oak and crepe myrtle. I walked the street, likely planted on Marshall's orders, trying to picture the famously stoic general commanding anything other than a global conflict. From June 1932 to 1933, Marshall presided over this fort during its own identity crisis, watching its coastal defense guns give way to the drudgery of infantry training. He and his wife lived in Building 38, a prominent home that now functions as a private residence, its secrets tucked behind a modern front door. I stared at the structure for a long moment, half expecting a 5-star general to appear on the porch and order me to get a haircut. My investigation of Marshall's local haunts, which involved walking roughly 3 blocks, took me past the requisite historic markers and suspiciously old-looking fence posts. I placed a hand on the cool concrete of Battery Garland, a mammoth fortification whose casemates once held 12-inch shells capable of rearranging the Atlantic. Today, its powder magazines and shell rooms house the museum I had just left, a space that stores history instead of the means to make it. Even the theatre Marshall patronized, a handsome 1930 Art Deco building, remains standing thanks to a community rescue, though its seats are no longer segregated by military hierarchy. The walk yielded no lost diaries or forgotten sabres, only the overwhelming sense that history's giants also had to endure slow days at the office. This seaside sojourn was a footnote in a monumental life. A mere 6 years after leaving Tybee's coastal breezes, Marshall became Chief of Staff on the day Germany invaded Poland. He oversaw the expansion of the U.S. Army from a few 100,000 men into a force of over 8 million, a logistical feat comparable to assembling a small country from scratch and then teaching it to march in step. Later, as the only officer to serve as both Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, he launched the European Recovery Program, the Marshall Plan, and earned a Nobel Peace Prize for his troubles. His name remains here, of course. General George C. Marshall Boulevard dutifully directs traffic near the lighthouse, ensuring his legacy is securely tied to modern wayfinding and the occasional lost tourist searching for a t-shirt shop. It is a quiet tribute, a world away from the global stage he would soon command. Standing there, looking from the street sign back toward the old fort, it felt like a silent, deep breath before the plunge, the universe giving him one last chance to enjoy the sunshine before handing him the bill. Cutlasses and confetti, Tybee toasts, its pirate stopover. Some days, history comes at you wearing an eye patch. We left the ordered silence of Officers' Row, walking out of the ghost of General Marshall's boot camp, and straight into a riot. The island's historical dial had been violently spun back from the 1930s to the 1720s, and the disciplined ranks of the 8th Infantry had been replaced by a staggering horde of buccaneers. It was Tybee's annual pirate celebration, a phenomenon that turned the main drag into a slow-motion casting call for a community theatre production of Treasure Island. Grown men who looked like they normally audited tax returns brandished plastic cutlasses, their faces fixed in scowls that seemed less focused on pillaging and more on remembering their lines. The logistical fallout of this invasion was that dinner became a tactical nightmare. Every restaurant, tavern, and fish fry shack was overrun, booked solid by revelers in tricorn hats and polyester sashes. The Crab Shack, a local institution, was ground zero, hosting a buccaneer ball that married the swashbuckling romance of the high seas with the practical necessity of disposable lobster bibs. My son raised a speculative eyebrow at the scene, a silent commentary on the human condition that I quite appreciated. We staged a strategic retreat, abandoning the main thoroughfares for the quiet hinterlands of the island. There we found a small eatery with no line, no skull and crossbones flags, and food that was perfectly, blessedly fine. Sanctuary secured, I could finally sort through the actual record of the Georgia coast, which is usually less colorful than the gift shops suggest. In the decades before the colony was founded, this coastline functioned as a maritime no-man's land. With the Spanish retreated south of the St. Mary's River and the English not yet in control, the region offered an unpoliced playground for anyone with a fast ship and flexible morals. The barrier islands and twisting river inlets were ideal for careening, dragging a vessel ashore to scrape the hull clean, and for lying low when the Royal Navy got too curious. Legends claim everyone from Blackbeard to Stade de Bonnet used these hideouts, though Tybee Island itself likely served as vivid scenery for refilling water barrels rather than a command center. The region's most solid link to the golden age of piracy isn't a bearded captain but a woman with ties to nearby Charleston, Anne Bonny. Born in Ireland around 1698, she spent her youth in Charlestown after her father moved the family to escape a scandal, a relocation that simply allowed her to jump from the frying pan into a much more interesting sea-borne fire. Anne married a small-time sailor named James Bonny, got herself disowned, and then met the far more successful pirate Calico Jack Rackham in the Bahamas. In 1720, she joined his crew along with Mary Red. Her career was short, violent, and sharply concluded. By October of that same year, their ship was captured off Jamaica. While Calico Jack and the men were swiftly executed, Bonny deployed a brilliant bit of legal footwork known as pleading the belly, delaying her sentence by claiming pregnancy. Her execution was stayed, but her ultimate fate remains one of history's great disappearing acts. She may have died in a Jamaican prison, or, as some prefer to believe, her wealthy father may have quietly paid for her release. Back in the booth, free from the roar of cannon and the clashing of plastic swords, the silence felt appropriate for a history defined by gaps. Southward sands, jetties, quakes, floods, and pirates. We retreated to the beach, trading the plastic cutlasses and polyester sashes of the strip for a damp, grey expanse of sand smelling of salt and the rich decay of pluff mud. Here, the Atlantic Ocean staged a private performance to fill the silence we had sought in the booth. A dolphin, playing to a sold-out crowd of 2, erupted from the surface. It hung in the air, impossibly large and close, and fixed me with a look that suggested my understanding of the coastline was decidedly superficial. For my encore, it seemed to say, I will now deconstruct the geologic history of Holocene versus Pleistocene barrier islands. It was a fair point. Standing on a Georgia beach means standing on the most recent draft of a 40,000-year-old argument between land and sea. Tybee is a geological infant, a Holocene island barely 5 millennia old. These younger formations are flighty, perpetually shifting their dunes like a nervous host rearranging furniture, while further inland sit their older, more established Pleistocene cousins. Islands that have had time to grow forests and develop a stable sense of self. The entire system is creeping toward the mainland, as if the islands have tired of the ocean's drama and are slowly backing away from the conversation. This geologic fickleness made the military history we had just engaged with seem even more ambitious. Erecting a serious fortification on this coastline demanded more than just scooping up free rocks. When the U.S. Army moved to build Fort Pulaski on the marshy sponge of Cockspur Island in 1829, they ran headlong into a foundational crisis. The ground was, for all practical purposes, a liquid. A junior lieutenant named Robert E. Lee was tasked with the problem. He designed an elaborate system of dikes to drain and stabilize the site, only for new surveys to suggest the marsh still wouldn't support the weight. An early, humbling lesson in the advanced science of strictly not building a 7 million brick fort on a swamp. The conflict between human ambition and coastal indifference continues. The long jetties constructed in the 1890s to scour the Savannah River channel have starved Tybee's north beach of sand, requiring regular nourishment projects to maintain its figure, like a fading starlet relying on collagen injections. The land is sinking while the sea is rising, a combination that produces king tides, a regal name for the days when the Atlantic borrows the streets and parking lots without asking, as we had seen in the flooded low-country village of Pin Point. Instability here isn't limited to water. The region is shadowed by the Charleston seismic zone, a reservoir of deep, ancient geological grudges. In 1886, the fault awoke with a violence that rattled teacups as far north as Boston. Generally, brick towers sitting on soft sand do not fare well in such conditions, The Tybee Lighthouse cracked from the strain but did not fall. A quiet monument to 19th century engineering winning a round against angry geology. After a day spent contemplating shifting sands, liquefaction and shaky ground, the straightforward brutality of local bird life came as a relief. I watched a seagull deliver a full-body flying tackle to another over a grievance only they understood. The act was so direct, so devoid of existential dread, that it felt like a palate cleanser. That evening, as if to bring the day's themes together in a neat, chaotic package, we watched Pirates of the Caribbean in our room, a story of nautical disaster on a shifting sea. Everything was fine. And that brings us to the close of Chapter 5, Booty, De Soto and Tybee Pirate Week, where a 16th century entrada that began with a pearl necklace on the Savannah River ended with a body sinking into the Mississippi and 7 makeshift boats limping toward Mexico, all of it somehow rhyming with a modern-day pirate festival on a barrier island where king tides still remind everyone who's actually in charge. This was the final chapter of The Rise the Limit, and I appreciate you sticking around for the whole ride. If you enjoyed this journey, the complete travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon, Palmetto Bugs and Broken Arrows. And if you want to come behind the scenes and get bonus content, you can join my community on Patreon. Thanks for listening and fair winds.